horror stories. Now, do you want to teach these to the young? And doesn't Plato have but he's running dead set against Greek society. These were the kinds of stories that were told to children. Did it have a negative influence on them? I suppose in some contexts it could. I can't imagine it having any particular good influence on the children. I would think they would simply grow up full of terror, if anything. So what you have here is a shift in the gods from the Titans, who were barbaric in every conceivable sense, and murderous and vicious, and then over to the gods, of whom Zeus was the big shot. Okay? Now, no. In fact, you may say, oh, I don't like Plato at all, he's against the arts. But then there's a certain part of writing, which is an art, which you would not give over to young people. And I think I would do this if I had a school system or a Presbyterian Sunday school or anything like that. I would not raise young people on horror stories or sex stories on the assumption that they would find out about horror and about sex and about the misuse of sex very easily. Our society is sort of drenched in it. Bergson called it the, what? No, he had a better name for it than sex-crazed society. But at any rate, we're bathed in it. Do we have to educate people in it? And that would then also be in I suppose, reforming your religious literature, which again was Hesiod and Homer. In reforming your religious, you would not have the gods fighting each other. Okay? When the Christian says God has three parts, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, we do not picture those as trying to murder each other. We try to picture that as aspects of one thing. This is God in three persons, or in three existences. But the Greeks had polytheism, in which they had many gods, and their gods could not be presented as fighting each other, and as tricking each other, and as lying to each other, and as hurting each other, and hurting their children of the others. And yet, if you read Homer or Hesiod, the gods are doing all this bad stuff all the time. Okay? And so Plato says, of course, when you read Plato, Socrates says this, this, and this, and somebody says, yes, Socrates. And then Socrates says this, and somebody says, oh, you're so right, Socrates. And then he says this, and says, oh, damn, Socrates, everything you say is true, which you know wouldn't have happened. So I was trying to find some of these. So we have the stories of the gods warring, fighting, or plotting against one another. But those aren't true. The battles of gods and giants and all the various stories of gods hating their families or friends should neither be told nor even woven in embroideries. Don't want this in macrame, okay? If we're to persuade our people that no citizen has never hated another and that it's impious to do so, unpious, not good, that's what should be told to children from the beginning by old men and women. And the poets should be compelled to do the same sort of thing. You don't want Hera being chained by her son, nor Hephaestus being hurled from heaven by his father, and so on. That is, the gods are not in a war with each other, a civil war or any other kind, and therefore this will be excluded from what is told to the young, which is to exclude it essentially from the society, at least most of the, until someone is grown up. Then and Plato's not clear about it, then people can read this literature, but not before their basic character is formed. Even Freud said that your basic character is formed by the time you're 5 or 6 years old. Was Freud right? Partly. Those early experiences can be very important for a person. Okay. Now, a God is, I'm on the bottom of page 185, the second page. Now, a God is really good. Plato didn't get rid of the gods. He said there are gods, but they move the planets. Now, this is not what, Apollo did, and this is not what Dionysus did, and this is not, but that's what Plato's gods do. And the gods are then above evil and above war and above faction. Okay? So, would you agree with this? What would happen to literature if you, say, didn't allow anyone younger than 21 to read The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is the story of a man who enslaves a bunch of African natives and then treats them as badly as he can? Or, say, a book in French called Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. Would you have young people read that? Would you have them read any of the French decadent poets? Would you have them read decadent sex poetry? What would become of, say, some parts of William Faulkner's novels, which deal with castration, or which deal with murder, or which deal with that? Where do you draw the line and say, okay, we can't have this in the arts, or if we have it in the arts, we can't have it perhaps published? You would perhaps not believe what America was like when I was your age. I keep saying that, but I think it's a nice functioning contrast, and it does educate. That is, you can't believe the degree of in which literature and movies and music and were censored in the United States, in Dallas, in Houston, in San Antonio, in New York, in Pennsylvania, and who knows, even in LA, which is so hard to believe. We don't do that anymore, or only within sort of tacit limits. So is it better to have freedom of expression? Because Plato is not wildly caught up in the concept of freedom of expression. He wants to talk about limits to expression, at least when it comes to the young people, till their character is basically formed and they gradually become less naive and learn about the evils in the world, but the evils are not part of their character. Okay? And the characters of the gods have to be such that they never delude anybody. So here on page 187, I will read to you, what? Would a god be willing to be false, either in word or deed, by presenting an illusion? Oh, I don't know. I don't know that a true falsehood, if one may call it that, is hated by all gods and humans. What do you mean? I mean that no one is willing to tell falsehoods up to the most important part of himself about the most important things, but of all places, he is most afraid to have falsehood here. That is, does the God lie to himself? Is there a lie in the soul? And the answer is, of course not. That's because you think I'm saying something deep. I simply mean that to be false to one's soul about the things that are, to be ignorant and to have and to hold falsehood there, is what everyone would least of all accept, for everyone hates a falsehood in that place most of all, when you lie to yourself. That's right, Socrates. Gee, you sure are intelligent. Surely, as I said just now, this would be most correctly called true falsehood. An imitation of this affection in the soul, an image of it that comes into being after it, and is not a pure falsehood. Isn't that so? Yes, Socrates. And that kind of lie is most deeply hated by the gods and man. So what is he saying? When we portray the gods, we must portray them as not fighting each other, but as not deceiving each other or deceiving themselves. So the gods must be people entities that tell themselves the truth and tell others the truth, and which find a place where there is order rather than which there's chaos. Now, if Nietzsche were in the room listening to me in my somewhat, even at this age, amateurish reading you of these passages, I think he would have been very angry. Maybe he would have slapped me in the face with leather gloves, or, spat on me to declare his contempt. But Plato is making a society in which Apollo reigns and Dionysus is set off to the edges everywhere. He's really not being allowed in Plato's Republic. And so finally, we talk about poetry. Whether or not we'll allow tragedy and comedy in our city. And then instead of answering this as directly, and again, here's Nietzsche saying, look, you fool, these tragedies and these comedies hold your society together by giving release to these Dionysiac impulses that are part of humanity. Nietzsche seems to think they're the better part. And then he gives you 115 different definitions of Dionysiac, so that you're not sure which one of these is the part that he likes or what Dionysus he cares about. But when Plato builds an ideal society, it's Apollonian. There's order, there's form, there's limits. The people in that society trust each other. They trust each other to do their jobs. And if you don't have that kind of trust, you have chaos in a society. So, will we have tragedy or comedy in the city? Now, Plato's answer to that, and I'll try to get this all done in this lecture. I may not succeed. We'll have to go to the next lecture when we talk about feminism and art. But I think probably the answer is no. That Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and the comic poets and dramatists are going to be exiled from the ideal republic. I cannot see how reading Sophocles is going to make you immoral. I don't see anything like that. And some of Aeschylus and some of Euripides, perhaps. But Sophocles won't be allowed in the Republic by all appearances. And so instead of giving us this directly in these passages, he comes up with a metaphor. He says, okay, there are things like beds and chairs and tables. Yes, Socrates. And these are different. There are different kinds of chairs. I mean, you think of fold-out chairs and plastic chairs and wooden chairs and metal chairs and elaborate French chairs of the time of Louis XIV and plain wood chairs of the American frontier, but they're all chairs. So who knows the chair best? The geometer, who can tell you exactly where the stress points are and what the geometry is, and so why the chair functions that we can use it to sit on, or whatever else we use it for. We can go into the science of it and know what makes a good chair. So the person who really knows is the geometer, who's the scientist, who sees the true forms. I mean, if I went in the living room and got some chairs, I could show you what are not quite straight lines, but have some curve, but then those curves absorb weight and shock better than straight lines, and so forth. So what is it to imitate nature? That's mimesis again. Well, the person that knows the universal form then imitates something real. The person who then has the closest connection to that form is a workman, somebody, a carpenter. Maybe the analogy would be an architect, or someone who builds an internal combustion engine. Whatever it is, they're the people who take this form of things and put it into effect in the world. But what does the artist do? Does the artist know how an internal combustion engine works? Italian futurist art, this 20th century art, they used to love to give fast cars and trains going 100 miles an hour. And you could just see the stress in the car and the train, and that's how the modernists wanted. Did any one of those modernists know how to design or run a locomotive? No. Do they know how to design or run one of these fancy Italian cars? Because even then they had them, the Maseratis of the 1930s. No, they don't. Do any artist who paints a bed, for example, know how to make a bed? No. Do they care? Probably not. They simply draw a picture of something that's halfway between reality and not as real. And here's the artist who is at 3 removes from reality, painting things, giving you the semblance of things which he or she, the artist, doesn't understand. So the tragedian would then be somebody, the comedian, somebody who writes, like Aristophanes, comic plays, some of which we still read and some of which we still find funny. Would you say that they know what they're talking about, or that they are really 2 removes from truth? And Plato's answer is, and really, I'm not telling you should like this, but I'm telling you should get it in your notes, and so I'll say it again. I call that good teaching, but that's self-defense, okay? The artist is at 3 removes from reality. The craftsman is at 1 remove, and those who see the true geometrical forms see things truly. They see the forms. But the artist is always at 2 removes from reality, and therefore we don't want that kind of thing presented in our society. End of quote. End of what Plato gives you in this passage. There are other passages in the Republic in which much the same sort of thing is said. But I'm not sure that Sophocles is at 3 removes from reality. He's not dealing with desks or internal combustion engines. He's dealing with people. And presumably, Sophocles would have had a deep and a broad experience of people before he goes out to write a comedy. I said I'm speaking not for Nietzsche, but I'm speaking against Plato. That if you know people, and you know them in profundity, and a bunch of other things like how to use language and how to design a play and all that sort of thing, you might well be doing a play which actually sustains the Platonic ideas. Many tragedies teach moral lessons. If you take Macbeth or Julius Caesar, these are plays that raise moral questions, but they don't raise immoral questions, and they don't raise stupid questions. So if comparing an artist to somebody who's not as bright as a carpenter, and I have nothing at all against carpenters, is rather strange, because the dramatist does not need to know what a technician or a craftsman needs to know in terms of working with things with your hands. A dramatist needs to know people. And whether that's Tennessee Williams or Eugene O'Neill or the any of a number of other 20th century people who've done plays, they may have a very close relationship to what people are, what society is, and how things function, in which the case they would not be at three removes from reality. They would be up close to reality, close to seeing what the philosopher sees. So I've given you Plato's theory in an abridged form. I've talked to you about Plato in the world of transcendent forms, and I've said that Plato's metaphor is very strange when it comes to some poets. I'm thinking of Robert Frost. And you remember me saying what I heard Frost say on television one time long ago, 50 years ago, that poetry gets life by the throat. And when I go back and read some of his Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening or The Black Cottage or any of a number of other of his poems, he really isn't just being fluffy, he's trying to get at what the experience of life is. I would not exclude him from my republic or have any need to. But when you have other poets whose subject matter is sex, for example, or which glorify immorality, which Nietzsche, it seemed to me Nietzsche would almost have to accept that as acceptable art. I find it not so acceptable. And while I think knowledgeable people should have the knowledge gained from that negative literature, I think we will be wise not to bring that up, put the children into that until they're ready for it. And I don't know whether maybe the last 2 years of high school you start giving them the hard stuff, but I sure wouldn't dump that on people in junior high and the beginning of high school. They'd say, well, Dr. Gunter, you're an old fuddy-dud. Well, I may well be. That may be true. All these years may make me kind of dull. But the question is, I think, a live question, whether you accept Plato's, the way that Plato deals with it, or the rationale that Plato uses. Is the artist really at three removes? I really don't think that's necessarily true. And I end up with, by pointing out something rather interesting, and that is that you don't see any criticism in Plato of Greek sculpture or Greek architecture. There's no criticism of the Parthenon. The only time I was in Athens, I remember standing there not far from the Piraeus, which is the port, looking out on a little spit of land, and here was a temple to Poseidon. Now, Poseidon is the Greek sea god. And the Romans took him over and gave him another name, but the Greeks were, after all, a shipping empire, and they had to be nice to Poseidon or he would sink their ships. So there it is, all by itself, only about maybe half of it's still there, the rest, the top and the entablature, they're gone. Deeply moving, but it's of the god Apollo always speaking. The form, the order, the symmetry of a Greek temple have been marveled at for millennia. How do they do that? So, while Plato is radically critical of the Greek Homer and Hesiod, which was their religious literature, and deeply critical of Socrates and Aristophanes, he's not critical of the Apollonian side of Greek civilization. And I think he has a rather strange picture of the artist at three removes. I think of landscape artists who go to extreme efforts to portray wild nature as it is, and which most people don't see. Are they 3 removes from the waterfall? I don't think so. And they would argue that they're getting closer to it than a technician who could talk about how many acre feet of water pass over the bridge in 29 and a half minutes. Well, that might be very important to know, but if you don't understand the tumult and the power of the water, a set of statistics may be taken as a remove from reality. So we have a hard time in the modern world accepting Plato's Republic as Plato wrote it, and we have no one talented enough to write a better one, and so we criticize Plato. And so tomorrow we start talking about feminism in art, and I will have to express my guilt. This was something I didn't even think about when I was your age, young nippers. Feminism was as odd to me as some species in the African veldt that I'd never seen before. Even though the women in my family were certainly fierce, and we used to say with complete justice, if the women in our family had fought the Civil War, the South would have won. And so we'll have feminism starting then in the next lecture.